This class will be case studies live on air, as taught by James Tanner. And many of you who have been with us have had visited the classes that Brother Tanner has taught, and you'll recognize him as a very skillful researcher. He has a good sense of humor for somebody from Arizona, and he's actually very much involved 24/7 in doing researching and improving our abilities as users of the family search programs and other programs available to help us find our relatives. This class day will be an interactive class. It is recorded, and again, the conclusion of the class, the recording will be sent to the archives, available in about a week for you to access. I will now turn the time over to Elder Tanner.
Okay, glad to be here and talking again about doing some research. I'm alive, but the people I'm going to research aren't alive. So live research, I don't know quite what that would mean, but that's what we're doing. The person I chose to look at today is Henry Sutton. He was born in 1753 and died in 1823. And all of that was in Lancashire, England. And there's a lot of very interesting things about this. And one of the reasons why this person is an interesting person is you'll notice he has 45 sources, and you'll say, well, why are we working around on a person that has 45 sources? Isn't that enough? And do we not believe all those sources, or what's the story here? Well, let's kind of look at this. One of the things that you need to realize is that you can view this person's tree. That means you put that person right in the center of a pedigree, and then that shows his children, and it also shows his ancestors. That kind of gets rid of the extraneous clicking through the pedigree to get to the person. Another thing you can do is look at all of his descendants, and a lot of people, relatively not a lot, but some people have lots of their ancestors identified already, because they are like me and they've had people in their ancestors, my great-grandmothers and others, who did research over 100 years. So there's lots of people. Here it looks like all of his people have been identified, and and have spouses. So you're going down the list here on the screen. You can see little arrows, and those indicate that each of those people have some descendants. There's two children who do not have descendants, and one died very quickly, 1790 to 1790, and one lived 3 years, 1797 to 1820. So they obviously did not get old enough to have descendants. But what happens if we increase that descendancy view a little bit? Let's go out to 3 generations and start to look down the line here. What we begin to see is quite a number of people who have no research done. So we can look at all the ones who died young, and obviously back in these time periods, a significant number of children died as they were underage. When they say they died as an infant, infant included up to age 18. So infant was not it was a legal disability, meaning they weren't of age to enter into contracts and things like that until they were 18. Depending on the jurisdiction, it could be 18 or 21. So the fact that they died young was significant from a genealogical standpoint because they didn't get married and died before they could get married. Obviously, other people didn't get married simply because they never got married, and they may have lived many, many years. But what we see here are lots of people that are marked deceased and yet show no marriage and no death date. That's an instant clue that person has had almost no research done. In other words, as we go down, we see more and more of those deceased, some of them dying young, deceased. It means in all of those cases that there have been almost no research done on those people. Each of those people is a prime candidate for research. And in many cases, you'll find that they did live long enough. They did get married and they have a family. And now you have some descendants that could number into the hundreds or even into the thousands, because we're starting quite early here back in the 1800s. So if we move this over to four generations down, which takes a couple of seconds, we have even more names. So here's a whole list of people who were born in the early 1800s who have no spouses and no death dates. Now, another problem can be is that someone is shown as getting married and only having one or two children, and that's quite unusual back in those days. And so that would be another one, or no children. So we have some options here that will basically let us do research for a long time. Now, why Henry Sutton? Back to that question, going back to his children and family. Before I start doing descendancy research on Peter Sutton, I want to make sure that one, he is a son of Henry Sutton, and two, that he actually existed, and do some research and see if I believe that he's let's say a real person, not a real person, but a person in my line, and that I'm actually related to him. So that's kind of the way this works, is that by going through this process of starting with an ancestor who lived relatively far back. Now, what's the advantage that I'm looking at in England? Well, here in England, I'm looking at people, once I look at the children of Henry Sutton, all of these children, except for the ones that I noted that were deceased as young people, lived until 1855, 1865, 1843, 1860, etc. And why is that significant? Well, it's significant because the English census, the English Wales census, began in 1841 to list people and their families. That dates 1850 in the United States, but it was a few years earlier in England. And that may have been, of course, one of the incentives of why they began that process in the United States. But because we have an 1841, 51, 61, 71, 81, et cetera, census records, doing research in England beginning in this time period is fairly straightforward, as long as you don't get off your focus and end up adding people who are not really your ancestors. So let's kind of look at Henry Sutton and see whether he is a suitable candidate for doing descendancy research. Well, first of all, we need to know if he existed. So we look and we see that he has an English baptisms, Church of English Baptisms, with a birth date of 6 April 53, and he has parent father's name of Henry Sutton. And if we check back quickly from back to his detail page, we'll find out that his father's name was Henry Sutton. And if we do more of that checking, we find out that it's probable that this is correct. And so this information is correct. So why not go back one more generation? I could do that, but for the purposes here, I began with Henry. You have to make a choice, and it's sort of arbitrary as to where you start. Every time you go back one generation, finding more records is more difficult. And when you find people who are born, who are in that category of people who were born straddling census record times, is when you really have an opportunity to work through it with at least sources that are tell you a lot more information than simply a baptism. Now, one of the things that's interesting is about this list here of places. And another thing that's interesting about Henry are the sources. One of those things that you might want to be aware of is looking down through the sources here. We see a reference to England, Lancashire, nonconformist church records. So what are nonconformist church records? Well, anyone who was not a member, a baptized member of the Church of England and belonged to one of the other churches, Methodist, Catholic, if they were Jewish, if they were Baptists, whatever, they were all called nonconformists. They didn't conform to the state religion, which was the Church of England. Called Episcopalians here in the United States and called Anglicans in some cases.
Elder Tanner,
Yeah.
can you zoom in a little bit so that it's a little bit easier to see?
Sure, absolutely.
Awesome. That should make people happy.
Okay. Anyway, so the question is, were these people nonconformists? And basically what that means is that it raises the let's say intense level of doing research. It makes it not more difficult in a sense, but it makes it a little more, yeah, let's just admit it's going to be a lot more difficult to find nonconformists in England than it is to find someone who was baptized in the and christened, if the word you want to use that word, in the Church of England. So let's look at that, because I think that's kind of an interesting thing. How are these people nonconformists? And is that correct? Well, let's go to the actual record here. So we'll go look here. They've changed FamilySearch around a little bit. And so now you don't actually get the actual record. All of a sudden you're getting another page in here that shows you information, and you say, well, I already know that information, and et cetera. Anyway, but this is, you still have the original document. It says down here, England, Lancashire, Nonconformist Church Records, 1647 to 1996, database, entry for Henry Sutton. So now we go look at the original document. And it happens to be a book. And it's interesting. Okay, so let's look at the whole book. And let's go back. In fact, we can jump back to page 1 of the book. Here we are. And it really doesn't say anything. Apparently, it starts somewhere in the middle of a book. And you go, it's 1,000 pages of this, and the book is probably not 1,000 pages. So this is kind of a strange situation here. What I'm trying to do is determine, is this nonconformist records? What is it? Where did it come from? What is it? Well, when we look at that and we go to a full screen on that, and we go to an individual record, and we'll have to go back to Henry and click on his link again to go back to that one page. We want to be on that page. Now we look down here and it says information. So we go down here to information and we start looking at what's inside of where this actually came from. The citation is England, Cheshire Parish Registers. Doesn't say anything at all about nonconformists. And it says the registers of Kirkby, the one that is his church is the parish of Winwick, chapelry of New Church, chapelry of Croft with Southworth. And it's all these different records are in here. I hate to tell you this, but none of these are nonconformist records. So basically, if you're looking for nonconformist records, this is not nonconformist records. These are Church of England records, all of them. So starts out with the locations of the Church of England registers in Manchester and Salford, which has nothing to do with Cheshire and has nothing to do with anything. So here's the problem. The problem is that this could be very, very misleading to someone who was not going further than simply reading the labels on the catalog on FamilySearch. And if we look at this, as far as this parish register, if I click on this Winwick parish register, we'll see it's the chapelry, but we'll find out if we get into it that it contains baptisms, burials, and all sorts of information. So what do we do with this record? Well, if you understand that principle, that when you go to the catalog in the family search, that the individual records that show up in that record may not be consistent with the label, then you'll find that then what that gives you to, it either makes you get a headache immediately, or it indicates to you that searching records on Family Search or any place else is not just a matter of clicking on links and copying out information. Because if you're looking for a marriage record, this book has marriage records, and it also has death records and birth records. And they're not nonconformist records. They're in various locations primarily around Lancashire, but with stuff that may or may not be in Lancashire. So even though it says that may not be the case. Now, what happens, for example, are you saying, oh, that's just my heritage? I mean, that's just Family Search. So there's really, we shouldn't really be, it's just, let's just not worry about it. Okay, well, what I'm trying to do here is I'm looking down to see all of these so-called nonconformist records. And as I go down through those records, we'll see that, one more here. There are other different records with marriages. Like here's his marriage record, or a marriage record. And you can also see, and it says right up here, Winwick. And if you look at the information, it'll say all different sorts of things. Unsworth Wesleyan Chapel. It'll say Warrington Parish, St. Mary's and All Saints Whaley in Lancashire, Warrington Methodist Chapel. See, that's where they got the nonconformist. Somebody picked up the fact that there was Methodist records scattered in here with all of the Church of England records. So now we have a title that says nonconformist, even though the bulk of the records in this are actually from the Church of England. Now, I just wanted to make that point because it's something you may not realize, and it's something that we continually tell people and help people to understand, is that we still need to look carefully at the records and go through them page by page and make sure we are getting the record that we think we're getting, and that the interpretation of the record doesn't come from a label that was put on for cataloging purposes and not for doing research purposes. Okay, so if we go back now to Henry Sutton, and we're satisfied, I'm satisfied as I go to the details, that he is actually, this is who he is. And this says he was christened in Ashton in Makerfield. Okay, so let's look at that source and see. Let's collapse all these. And then turn that off, and that'll collapse them back down. So here's Cheshire, and here's Lancashire. Wait a minute. Those are two different counties, and we have Henry Sutton in two different counties. That's almost always right off the bat an indication that, well, there's a problem here, because we picked up Henry Sutton. So here's a question. How common is Henry Sutton as a name in England? Well, here we can go to Find My Past, and we can look up Henry Sutton, and we've got his birth is 1763, and we'll do plus or minus. Let's just kind of expand that to like 10 years. And here we have 51 people who are possibly christened in Ashton and Makerfield and Lancashire. And so there we are with 51 different people with different death dates and different birth dates and marriage dates and all sorts of different types of who they are. So Henry Sutton is apparently a very common name in that particular area. So one way we can start to look and see what's going on here is to go back to Henry. And we say, okay, so we have someone with a fairly common name. So we really need to be really careful that all of the information is consistent. So we go down and looked at this children. And here's the children listed. We have Peter. And we're looking, first of all, we're looking at the dates. He died in 1823 and his wife died in 1829. First child's, and they got married in 1780. Just take it that I've looked through that, and that's fine. And so he's born, he's the first child, and he is born in a place called Billinge in Lancashire. And he dies in Par, Prescott, Lancashire. So what's Par, Prescott? And then we have Billinge. Mary is in Billinge. Thomas is in Ashton. Wait a minute. Mary and Thomas are born in the same year. So we have Mary Sutton in 1784 and Thomas Sutton in 1884. And if we click on Mary, we see she was born in June and Thomas was born in July. This isn't going to work. There's that they're not twins, and they're both in the same year. Now the question here is, this is not Billinge. She's christened in Billinge. He's christened in Aston. And so then we have Billing. Well, we need to work them on this one. And then we have Billinge, and then we have William Sutton and Billinge and Robert and Alice. So we have all the listed children, 9 listed children, who are all born in Billinge, with the exception of someone who's born the same year as another child, and he's born in some other place. But now we know, because we've already did some quick check with MyHeritage as to the frequency, that there's probably a lot of Henry Suttons wandering around in that particular area. So we have possibilities that this isn't correct. But one of the things we need to always check when we're doing research, we want to check, is to see where all these places are. So we're going to go, we'll get rid of a couple of tabs here, and we'll put in, go into maps on Google, and we'll put in Billinge. There we go. There's Billinge, and it's right there. The other places that are mentioned, and I won't go through that, just looking at what we do is look through all of the birth and death and marriage places and list all those places and then see how they all fit kind of together. You see here right next to it, and the scale on this is that distance is less than a mile. It's like 2,000 feet. And from here halfway, and then it's less than a mile between the center of Billinge and Ashton, Makerfield. So there's a really easy way that this could have gotten confused, because they're sitting right next to each other. And it's possible that some of the things could have happened. So this child may have been born over here just because they went over here to visit, and that's where the child was born. But generally speaking, we're looking at christenings, not at births. And christenings were not determined by the chance of where the baby was born. They were determined by the choice of the parents to where they had the child baptized. So there's a kind of a different situation. Some of the other places that are mentioned are Winwick, which is down here. And you can get down to where you have Winwick. And then you also, if you look a little bit around the same area, you'll find Wigan, which is another place. Now, what about the difference between Lancashire and the other, let's see, the counties, the two different counties, Cheshire. So the difference between Cheshire and Lancashire is very simple. If you look up the county, the parish that this is in, which happens to be down here in Winwick, and you'd go look for Winwick, in Winwick, Lancashire, England, you'll see it says Winwick, Cheshire, right there. Underneath it, it says Winwick, Lancashire Genealogy. So what is this? If you click here, and I know you can't read it, but it says Winwick is a village and civil parish in the borough of Warrington, Cheshire, England. And it says it is located within the historic boundaries of Lancashire. We're talking back in the 1800s, and that's historic. So Winwick was correct. He was born in Lancashire. He was not born in Cheshire. Now, it's recorded, and it should be recorded in the place where the person was born, but these Cheshires are popping up from the cataloging once again, cataloging in the family history, FamilySearch catalog, that they're cataloging these in Cheshire, even though basically the time period involved in the records should be in Lancashire County. So we're starting to see that there's some things you need to know in order to even evaluate this particular people. Now, what about, let's go back to Henry, and what about Thomas? Is Thomas a child in this family or not? Well, if we go down through Henry's list of sources, we can go down here and we see that, fortunately, what someone's already done sometime in the past is found a will. And so they have found the will of Henry Sutton, and Larry Linton found this, my cousin Larry, and he copied it, which fortunately for all of us, because this is the time-saving factor. And this is why we put in our sources. One reason is because then I can come in here with the question, and then I can say, well, then I could go out and do the research for the will, but now I don't have to. I don't have to go look for it, because one of my cousins already did made that effort and copied the pages in. So now I can click and look at the will. This is page 1 of the will, and it's in a file. So here's the first page of the will. We'll blow that up really big and go up to the top, and we'll start reading it. And it's in beautiful handwriting and very easy to read if you get used to reading cursive. So here he is, Henry Sutton of Par. So, okay, so he has told us that he lives in Par. So that confirms Par is a place out there that we need to be aware of. And if we did the map thing, we'd find out Par was right there next to all those other places. And then we read down the will. That the dates, 1822 is when this will is being written, and he died in 1823, so he was probably sick for a while and knew he was going to die, so he made a will. We often find wills made very, very shortly before the person dies, but this case he made a will before he died. And I mean, well, he always had to, but I mean, he made it a time period before he died. And he says his wife, Sarah. So we've confirmed Sarah, the name of his wife. And he gives her all of the things that he gives her, and we won't need to go through all the stuff that he gave her. So then he said, divided amongst my children, namely my son, Peter, and my daughter, Anne, and we have her married name, which is very helpful now because we can do some research directly on her, and my daughter, Mary. Now, if you'll recall, maybe you won't, I will, that Mary and Thomas were the two that were born in the same year. And so then we have Henry, there is no Thomas, and my son John, and my son Robert, And the ones that are named in the will are Peter, Anne, Mary, Henry, John, and Robert. And the two that died before their father, meaning before Henry did this will, were William and Alice. And so all the children are accounted for, except we have an extra child. Now let's go see whether or not that's going to make any kind of difference. And so we're clicking on, let's go to Thomas. Okay. So here we are with Thomas Sutton, and I'll pop that up a little bit so everybody can see it. And we're going to look for a source. And first of all, we have, right out of the bat, we have a source that says Church of England, Baptisms, Marriages, and Burials. And we look, and it's over on Ancestry. So we open that up. And we have some additional information on Ancestry it's helpful. It's not the same as what's on FamilySearch. One of the things that they have for the English records are a map. And so now we can look at a map of the parish register and the Lancashire parishes. So these are the Lancashire parishes sort of spread out. And those parishes are down here, and the places we've been talking about are down here in the bottom. So here's Wigan, and there's Billinge, and Ashton and Makerfield, and there's Winwick. And this is the edge of the parish, and here's Cheshire. And what happened is a very small boundary change in Cheshire put these parishes in a different county. And there was a major realignment of English county lines back in the 1970s, about 1974. So this is the time. Now you'll see here that there's that Ashton and Makerfield are just right next, but Billinge is actually in this Wigan place. So you really have to kind of work your way around these maps and things to get a real feel for the distances and the places that all of these things occurred. So from a standpoint of looking at this person as being consistent in a place, yes, Thomas is not only consistent from on the map, but let's look at his record. And this is, we'll zoom in on the record. I can't do that. I have to do it this way by clicking. Okay. And if we find the date, we'll see he was Thomas, son of Henry Sutton, born, et cetera, et cetera. And this is in Wigan, which is a different parish, and Ashton and Makerfield. And it's in the Church of St. Thomas. So if you're looking at this, you can understand why someone would have added him as a child to Henry Sutton in this particular list. But he's not in the will. And he is kind of the odd man out because he was baptized in a different church in a different town than all of the other children. And so the conclusion has to come, and he was baptized, he was born in the same year as a child who was mentioned in the will. So for all of those reasons, what we need to do is detach him as a child. Now, that's not going to erase Thomas. It's not going to create any problem with anything that's already been done about him. By the way, there's a duplicate out here, too, that needs to be done. And so there's work that could be done. And there were some sources attached and things. But basically, he's not in the right family. It's kind of not a good idea. I mean, not a happy thing to do, because look at all these children. But only reason he shows as being related to me is because he was added to this particular family. So basically, we can click on that and remove him. And I can say I reviewed the relationship, and I can remove the parents, and I can say Thomas does not, I got my hands in the right position, not appear in the will for Henry Sutton, born 1763. Okay, and blink. Okay, so now what we have is we have a we're going to get rid of some of these other things here. Now we're back to Mary, and we go to Henry. Okay, now we're back to Henry. Now from the standpoint of doing the research, we have established a family that we can very quickly check. So first of all, we want to see on William and Alice, and they show that they were born and they died in, and they have 7 sources. So let's look at the 7 sources. This is a christening record, shows him, Henry and Sarah, William, christened on 1790. And we can look here, births, deaths, and burials. We have William, 22nd December 1790, same place, Winwick, and Henry Sutton's the father. So we've established a reason why he is not in the will, and we've also identified him as being a person who is potentially and probably logically part of that family. We're showing up again nonconformist church records, nonconformist, and if we look at that, we have the same kind of thing that we had previously, where we look at the nonconformist church record right here, and it's on that page. This is from that book. And when we look at the information, we see that it's all of these other churches, and that there may be one in the list that's a nonconformist, but the rest of them are all definitely Church of England. And so if you were looking through the records and you said, well, we know the Suttons were not nonconformists, so why would I go search nonconformist records? Well, fortunately, in this particular case, these records are indexed. And because they're indexed, we were able to find this family, even notwithstanding the naming problem with it being identified as a nonconformist record. And if we do that, and we go through this process with each of the children, so then we're in the process of doing some descendancy research. So basically, if I take Henry Sutton here and bring him up, and then I view his tree and change it to the descendancy tree. And then I have Henry Sutton over here on this first tab. And then I will open Peter Sutton in a new link or new tab. So that gives me his descendancy. And then we can start to work on him. So now we have his sources. So we have marriages, and we've already determined that he is the son of William. So we're not so concerned about that. Now we're going through the same process that we went through with Henry, and that is we're going to look at his children and see what kind of consistency. First of all, we want to know if he has a marriage record and if her name was Ellen Neville. And so we look back to the sources and we come down here for England marriages, and we have Peter marrying Ellen Neville in Rainford, Lancashire. Oh, well, all of a sudden we have a new place. So we know all these people were from maps. We're from Billinge. So we're going to start with Billinge, and we'll see how far it is. We're going to ask directions to Rainford. And that says it's Rainford St. Helens. And it's about 3 miles away. So we have kind of a general rule in genealogy that depending on the time period and going back into these dates, back in the early 17 and mid 1700s and early 1800s, that people they got married, they were born and they were married and they died within about 6 to 10 miles of their home, of their birthplace. So he's married to somebody 3 miles away, which puts him in the absolute believability range of this of that being the case. So now when we're working our way on Peter Sutton, and we've got all these different records, birth records and everything. So the simplest way to check his descendants quickly are to simply click on them. So look here. So birth in 1816, died. And if we open up her in another line over here, we can see that she got married to Robert Neville. Now, that is another interesting thing because obviously we just verified that Peter's mother, that her mother was a Neville. So did she marry a cousin? The answer is yeah, probably. And so we've got another thing that starts to make an interesting discovery issue. It also shows that he died in 1838, which was only a year after they got married, and that there were no children, but she had a second husband, Philip Henley, and they had some children. And then we're starting to go down through each of the children and see where they were. And here we have died young, and one that lived quite a while. So we just can keep repeating that same procedure. We're just going to do this over and over again, and for each time. And so basically, how do I do it? Well, this is how I do it. I go down through, I chose the first person. So for instance, here, I chose Peter Sutton. And so I'm going to go down on each of these Sutton lines, and I'm going to keep going down on Peter Sutton's line until I get to the 20th century, till I get to people, actually 21st century, till I get to people who are born within the last 110 years and are possibly alive. And in that case, I'm not going to do any more work in searching. But once I have that whole line, then I would probably end up with considerable number of people. Now let's just for interest's sake to see what kind of possibility there is on his descendants. Realizing, of course, that I check periodically, am I really related to this person? And the answer is yes. He's going back to Henry, he's a 1 generation removed cousin. So here we are basically showing how I am related to this person back through my line. And this isn't really a very long line. And this isn't a great stretch to be working on a person who is related in that way. So basically what we're going to do is look to see what his tree looks like. And then we're going to go down, and we'll just jump out, since he only has a few children, we'll jump out to 4 generations. And right out of the bat, folks, we have no research past people who died in about, the last one is people who died, who were born in 1892, clear down here. But we have whole families where no research or very little research has been done. And there's an amazingly not a very large number of descendants of this person. And over here on the other side of the screen, we're seeing all sorts of things. May have had another spouse, no sources attached, person may have another spouse, and all of these are record hints to these people with fairly high accuracy. Occasionally they get off, but it's pretty accurate. And so we have a lot of records we could add. And so this person right here Some of them may be more difficult than others to find. We have Joseph Sutton Henley, and we have a record right here, and it says he was born in 1885, and we've got the National Register in 1939 for him. So if we look at that, it says he's a male and he's married, and it's got apparently that may be his wife, but we don't show a marriage here. So right now we already have found within a few minutes of doing this kind of process of looking people who can be added to the FamilySearch family tree who are not there and are not available and are available to be researched without too much problems, because we're getting blue record hints. So let's just see what happens if I open up this person as an example. There's the record hint right there. And there's no spouse. So if we look at this. Now, the 1939 register, you recall that every 10 years there's an English census. So there was one in 1901, 1911, 1921, 1931, but there was no 1931 census was lost. It was destroyed. 1941, they didn't hold a census because of the war, but they had to do a listing of all of the male people who could have been used. At that point, they were extremely in the middle of being bombed and having problems, and they needed to know a total number of people in the whole country that they could rely on to get into the military in various forms. And so they did a complete survey of all of the men, no matter what their age was. They were going to be going into the army at some point and fighting. And so that was the 1939 National Register. And that it works the same way in a sense. It didn't give us all the information we got earlier, but it made it. But he's 54 years old, so he's going to appear in some of the earlier censuses. And so those are the kinds of things, because he should be he was born in 1885, he should be in the 1891 and 1901 censuses. So we have a chance here to find a family and to carry on and doing a lot of research downline from these people. Okay. Well, I'm wondering if there's any questions, and if we'd...
Elder Tanner, there's a question. Would you make a note about the title of the record on the nonconformist? I'm assuming it's on the nonconformist stuff.
Oh, yeah, I've got it right here. Would you want me to put it in the chat or to send it to you or what?
I think he's just asking, would you make one? And I would ask, what would you say?
Oh, you mean what I would say on it?
Uh-huh.
You mean add a note to it and explain what it is? I just say this is not a nonconformist record. But regardless, it's in the past, I have found, for example, it will say Lancashire birth records, 1740 to 1890 or something like that. And I'll go into it. And the first page will be marriage records. And I'll say, oh, well, this is marriage records. This isn't birth records. And then I'll go through it and it'll say, here's some death records. And then, oh yeah, there are some birth records in here, but they're not, there's a lot of other records in here. The problem that you have with all catalogs is that the catalogs focus on one item or one topic in each in these records. And most of these records are interleaved. You'll find a page of baptisms with next page of marriages with the next page of death records, and then it'll start all over again with baptisms. So things like that were just the common with these records. And the only thing you can do when you're looking for records and you're, knowing that you have this kind of situation is address it directly and just start looking through the record to see if there are more records. Obviously, if you find what you're looking for, which is a christening record, and you have another record that shows yours a marriage record, and you have another record that shows a death record, and you have some other records, then your incentive to spend a lot of time looking through all of the other records is not great. But when you're doing what I'm doing, which is trying to make sure that each of the children in the family are actually the descendants of the person named, and there's some discrepancies, and you start seeing things like nonconformance records, then those should start raising sort of flags in your head that you are that there is something else you should be doing and places you should be looking. And one of them is to look at the record as a whole and determine how many different parts it has. And as I've indicated a couple of times now, when you click on a record in FamilySearch and look at a specific record, then you need to go to the original record. But this is no image available, and they've got this birth record registration index. And this takes you round and around in a circle, because the problem is you've got to get through all of this stuff to get to look at the actual list. But this is an index. In big letters, it says index. And that means there's really no records. It's just an index. So we need to go further and start looking for records from that time period, or waiting until we get some record hints or however else. So that's kind of the summary of what the answer to that is. And when I've gone to FamilySearch and said, your catalog's wrong, they've come back to me and said, well, why don't you tell us what's wrong with it? And my answer is, I don't know, put me on the salary, and then I'd be glad to correct your catalog. But anyway, I know that's not a very good answer, but it's kind of what the story is. I do research because I can go beyond that, but I just kind of help people understand that they may have to do that anyway. Okay.
Any other questions?
Everybody, either they're all totally depressed now that I've shown them that they have to go back and look through things, or
No, I love what you're doing. It's fun to start doing descendancy and going down and finding all the people that haven't been put into the picture.
Yeah, well, the answer to the question is, when people say it's all done, I say, do you have 5 minutes?
Yeah.
I can show you in your line where you've got hundreds and maybe thousands of people that you haven't even looked at that are related to you directly. So, it's just right now we're living in the golden age of doing genealogy, because we have the resources, we have lots of lines that have not been pursued, and we have work that can be done all over the world.
Yeah, there's a question said, when you detached the person not listed in a will, how did you know he was not just a wayward son excluded?
Because he was born in the same year as someone who was specifically named in the will and had a record for him. It's 2 months. Sorry. No mother is going to have 2 babies a month apart.
Any other questions?
No? Okay, thank you.